Something is breaking apart inside Iran, and the world isn't paying attention. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps no longer operates in the shadows of the supreme leader's will. It is the will. The IRGC controls ballistic missiles, proxy networks from Baghdad to Beirut, energy smuggling routes, and now, critically, the economic arteries that keep the Iranian state breathing. The elected civilian government in Tehran, a managed theater, a facade with a desk and a title, but no real sword. Here's what changes everything right now. The Gulf states are watching this internal fracture with cold, calculating eyes. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and their partners understand that when a military apparatus detaches from political accountability, it becomes unpredictable. And unpredictable nuclear-adjacent powers don't negotiate, they escalate. If Gulf retaliation, economic, military, or proxy, triggers a miscalculation inside this fractured Iranian command structure, you won't get a regional skirmish. You'll get a war that reshapes every oil price, every alliance, and every assumption about American power projection in the Middle East. Let's go back to the beginning. Not 1979, but further. Let's go back to the idea of what the Islamic Republic was actually supposed to be. When Khomeini built this system, he built it as a dual structure on purpose. You had the elected institutions, the president, the parliament, the technocrats, and then you had the unelected revolutionary institutions, the supreme leader, the guardian council, and the IRGC. The whole design was intentional. It was meant to keep revolutionary purity alive while allowing a degree of democratic participation that would give the system legitimacy in the eyes of ordinary Iranians. That was the theory. But theories don't survive contact with money, weapons, and decades of institutional entrenchment. What happened over the next 4 decades is one of the most profound institutional transformations in modern geopolitical history, and it happened so gradually that most Western analysts completely missed it. The IRGC didn't seize power in a coup. They didn't need to. They simply grew, organically, strategically, and relentlessly, into every corner of Iranian life. They moved into construction contracts after the Iran-Iraq war because the country needed rebuilding and they had the manpower. They moved into telecommunications because security required it. They moved into banking because sanctions created black market financial channels that only an organization with their reach could manage. They moved into the oil and gas sector because energy is the bloodstream of the Iranian economy, and they weren't going to let civilians control the blood. Each expansion was justified by necessity. Each expansion was permanent. By the time Hassan Rouhani sat in the presidency, genuinely trying to negotiate the JCPOA with the Obama administration, the IRGC had already made their position clear. They didn't oppose the deal loudly in the beginning. They let it breathe, they watched it, and then when Trump killed it in 2018, they were positioned perfectly to say, "We told you so. We told you the Americans cannot be trusted. We told you that diplomacy is a trap." And in that moment, the IRGC didn't just win an argument, they won the Iranian national narrative. That narrative said that resistance, not negotiation, is the only language the West understands. That missile programs, proxy networks, and regional deterrence are not aggression. They are survival. Now understand what that narrative does to civil leadership in Tehran. Every Iranian president since Ahmadinejad has operated under a ceiling, a hard ceiling that is not defined by the constitution, but by the IRGC's tolerance threshold. When a president tries to soften foreign policy, engage with the West, or redirect military budgets towards social spending, he bumps against that ceiling immediately. Not through direct confrontation. The IRGC is too sophisticated for that. It happens through the media ecosystems they control, through the judiciary they have influence over, through the Friday prayer networks that amplify certain messages and bury others. It is the most refined form of institutional veto power you will find anywhere in the world today, and it operates almost entirely below the surface of what international media covers. Masoud Pezeshkian won the presidency in 2024, presenting himself as a reformist, a pragmatist, someone who wanted to re-engage the world, and the international press got excited. There were op-eds about a new opening, about back-channel diplomacy, about a potential path to de-escalation. But here is the question that those op-eds never answered honestly. What exactly is Pezeshkian going to reform when the institutions that matter most, the ones controlling the missiles, the proxies, the financial arteries, don't answer to him? The presidency in Iran today is real in the sense that it manages bureaucracy, public services, trade negotiations within limits, and the daily machinery of the state. But it is not real in the sense that matters geopolitically. It does not control the sword. And Khamenei, who is the linchpin of all of this, is aging. He is in his mid-80s. He has survived longer than almost anyone predicted. But the question of succession is now not a theoretical future concern. It is an active, ongoing, covert political war being fought right now inside the system. And the IRGC is not a neutral party in that succession fight. They are the most powerful organized force in the country, and whoever becomes the next supreme leader will need their blessing or they won't last. That means the transition, whenever it comes, will not weaken IRGC influence. It will almost certainly entrench it further because the next supreme leader will owe them in a way that Khamenei, who built his relationship with them over decades from a position of greater independence, never had to. Now let's move to the external dimension, because what happens inside Iran doesn't stay inside Iran. The IRGC's entire strategic doctrine is built on projecting power outward. The axis of resistance, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, is not a collection of independent movements that Iran merely supports. It is a coherent, IRGC-managed network of force multiplication. Each node of that network serves a purpose. Hezbollah provides a deterrent against Israel from the north and maintains Iranian influence in Lebanese politics. The Houthis demonstrated in 2023 and 2024 that they could disrupt global shipping lanes in the Red Sea with drone and missile attacks, a capability that shocked the world and that the IRGC had spent years quietly building. The Iraqi militias provide land corridors connecting Iran to Syria to Lebanon, a Shia crescent of logistical power that gives Iran strategic depth in a way that no conventional military deployment could achieve. The Gulf states understand all of this viscerally. Saudi Arabia and the UAE don't need Western think tank reports to tell them what the IRGC represents. They have been living next to this expanding network for decades. The Abraham Accords, which normalized relations between Israel and several Gulf states, were not primarily about Israel. They were about building a counter-architecture against Iranian power projection. The Gulf states were essentially saying, we are more afraid of Tehran than we are opposed to Tel Aviv. That is a seismic geopolitical statement, and it reshaped the entire regional order. But here is where it gets genuinely dangerous in ways that most commentary doesn't fully reckon with. The IRGC's internal fracturing, yes, there is fracturing even within the IRGC itself, between older ideological commanders and younger, more technocratic military professionals, combined with the uncertainty of the succession period, creates a decision-making environment that is deeply unpredictable. In stable authoritarian systems, you always have a clear chain of command. You know who to call. You know who has the authority to say yes or no. In Iran right now, that clarity is eroding. Different IRGC commanders have different relationships with different factions within the leadership. Different proxy commanders in the field have different degrees of operational autonomy. And when you have a distributed command structure under pressure, the kind of pressure that Gulf retaliation, Israeli strikes, or American sanctions create, you dramatically increase the probability of miscalculation. Think about what happened with the IRGC missile strikes on Israel in April 2024 and again in October 2024. Those were the first direct state-to-state military strikes between Iran and Israel in history. Whatever the IRGC commanders thought they were doing strategically, calibrated escalation, demonstrating deterrence, responding to Israeli actions in Syria, the result was that they crossed a threshold that had never been crossed before. And they crossed it during a period of maximum regional tension, maximum proxy conflict, and maximum uncertainty about Iranian internal command coherence. That is not the profile of a system acting with crisp, unified strategic clarity. That is the profile of a system under strain, making high-stakes decisions through contested internal processes. Now bring the Gulf states into this equation actively. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been quietly expanding their own military capabilities for years. The Saudis have one of the largest defense budgets in the world. The UAE has built a professional military force that punches far above its size. Both countries have developed relationships with American military infrastructure, Israeli intelligence, and French defense contractors that give them a real combined arms capability. If the IRGC or its proxies were to carry out a strike against Saudi oil infrastructure the way they did in Abqaiq in 2019, or against UAE territory, or against a Gulf shipping corridor, the Gulf states are no longer in the position they were in 2019 when they absorbed that attack with minimal direct response. The political, military, and economic incentives for retaliation have shifted significantly. And if Gulf retaliation happens, let's say Saudi Arabia hits an IRGC asset in Yemen or Iraq or even inside Iran, what does the IRGC's response look like when the civilian government in Tehran has no real control over that response? This is the question that should be keeping American national security planners awake at night, because the answer is nobody knows with confidence. A civilian Iranian president can signal de-escalation. He can make phone calls. He can send messages through diplomatic back channels. But if the IRGC commanders decide that their institutional credibility requires a response, because backing down looks like weakness in their internal politics, then the president's de-escalatory signals become noise. And you are now in an escalation spiral driven not by national strategic calculation, but by institutional survival dynamics inside a military organization that controls nuclear-adjacent capabilities. The economic dimension makes all of this more combustible. Iran's economy has been under sanctions pressure for so long that the IRGC's parallel financial networks have become structurally necessary for the country's basic functioning. They control the smuggling of sanctioned oil. They control financial channels that bypass SWIFT. They control import networks for goods that cannot come through official channels. This means that the IRGC is not just a military organization, it is an economic actor with enormous constituencies inside Iran who depend on its networks for their livelihoods. Sanctions don't weaken the IRGC's internal power. In a perverse way, maximum pressure actually strengthens their position because it makes the civilian economy more dependent on the parallel economy that the IRGC controls. This is something American policy has consistently failed to account for across multiple administrations, Democrat and Republican alike. The energy markets understand the stakes, even if the political commentary sometimes doesn't. Every serious escalation involving Iran pushes oil prices, but the deeper concern for global energy markets is not a temporary price spike. It is the potential disruption of the Strait of Hormuz. Approximately 20% of all global oil flows through that strait. The IRGC's naval forces and the IRGCN have explicit doctrine and demonstrated capability for Strait of Hormuz closure operations, mining, swarming drone attacks on tankers, anti-ship missiles positioned along the Iranian coastline. If a Gulf retaliation to Iranian counter-response cycle reaches a point where the IRGC decides to threaten or execute Strait of Hormuz disruption, you are no longer talking about a regional war. You are talking about a global economic event that hits every country simultaneously, including China, which is Iran's largest oil customer and therefore has profound incentives to intervene diplomatically, but also profound interests in not appearing to take sides against its strategic partnerships. China's position in this entire dynamic is one of the most underanalyzed elements in Western coverage. Beijing has invested in the Iran-Saudi normalization agreement that it brokered in 2023. It has enormous economic stakes in Gulf stability because it imports massively from both Iran and the Gulf Arab states. It has a strategic partnership agreement with Iran signed in 2021, and it has an increasingly complex relationship with the United States, in which every crisis becomes another piece of the larger geopolitical chess game. If an Iran-Gulf conflict erupts, China will face impossible choices about where to apply diplomatic pressure and how visibly to do so without appearing to either abandon Iran or antagonize the Gulf states whose oil it needs. That pressure on Beijing's decision-making is itself a factor that reshapes global power dynamics in ways that extend far beyond the Middle East. Russia is another layer. Moscow and Tehran have developed a wartime partnership through the conflict in Ukraine. Iranian drones became a critical component of Russian strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure, and in exchange, Iran has received Russian technology, diplomatic cover, and economic relationships that partially offset sanctions pressure. If Iran becomes militarily engaged in a Gulf conflict while Russia is still fighting in Ukraine, you have two sanctioned revisionist powers simultaneously in active conflict, and the stress that places on the Western alliance system, the global weapons supply chains, and the American capacity to maintain deterrence on multiple fronts simultaneously is genuinely unprecedented in the post-Cold War era. All of these threads connect back to the fundamental question of control. Who actually controls Iranian decision-making when the pressure reaches its maximum point? If the answer is a coherent civilian military command structure with clear protocols and accountable leaders, then deterrence can work. Signals can be sent and received accurately, negotiations can happen, red lines can be established and respected, But if the answer is a fragmented IRGC command competing internally for succession positioning, operating parallel economic networks, controlling proxy forces with varying degrees of autonomy, and existing in institutional tension with a civilian government that lacks real authority, then deterrence becomes unreliable. Signals get garbled, red lines get misread, and one miscalculation inside that fracture can trigger a chain of events that none of the actors involved actually wanted or planned for. That is the real story of Iran in 2025 and beyond, not the headline diplomacy, not the presidential statements. The real story is this slow-motion internal power struggle between revolutionary institutions and civil governance, playing out against the backdrop of succession anxiety, sanctions pressure, regional proxy conflict, and a Gulf neighborhood that is increasingly armed, increasingly alert, and increasingly unwilling to absorb Iranian pressure without consequence. The world is not watching closely enough, and history has a habit of moving fastest, precisely when attention is elsewhere.